Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Emotional Grit, the podcast where you can learn about the power of perspective and the science that fuels us. I'm your host, Jennifer Fernjack, and I'm grateful to say that my guest today is Steph Horak. She is a social worker who has worked with older people in different settings such as long-term care, short-term care, hospice settings as well, you name it. And so I'm very grateful that today we can talk about the counterclockwise study that was done by Harvard. So without further ado, please feel free to like and subscribe to the podcast on the YouTube channel for this called Emotional Grit, and we'll go ahead and get things started. So thank you, Steph, for being here.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Well, thank you. I know that a lot of people, when they think about getting older, will lean more toward negative things. And so, what I'm hoping to do through the podcast today is talk about how, with this study, the question was posed, can someone's mindset possibly affect them physically? And through this study, it showed that it can. So, I'm looking forward today to sharing some snippets from the study and then hearing about some stories that you've either experienced or heard about or read about or that kind of thing as well that show and support what Harvard had to show in their study as well. So I'm going to go ahead and use my little cheat sheet that I have here about the counterclockwise study, just to tee things up. It reads here, the counterclockwise study conducted by Harvard psychologist Alan Langer demonstrated that elderly men in their 70s who spent a week in a curated environment designed to resemble 20 years earlier acted and felt younger. Participants showed improvements in memory, dexterity, posture, hearing, and vision, suggesting mindset significantly impacts physical aging. So that's kind of the capstone of the study. And then I want to provide some of the context for people as well. So in a nutshell, basically what she did is she had these gentlemen go to a retreat center where it was literally set up like it was 1959. And so 20 years earlier. And as you can imagine, back in 1959, things were a bit different. But the thing is, she didn't want people just to talk historically about things that happened back then. She wanted them to live it. So they literally would have a baseball game playing on the radio that would have taken place back then, or music that was relevant to those people at that time was playing. It could have been Elvis, or somebody else on the radio. Also, just for context, back in 1959, that's when Alaska and Hawaii became states. So that's kind of crazy to think about. It's also when the Barbie dolls were introduced and when Jiffy popcorn came into play. So crazy times back in
Things we're thankful
1959.
for.
Yeah, exactly. But so here's some more information about the study itself. All right. So basically, as I mentioned, they listened to music that was relevant back in the 50s. They also watched the Ed Sullivan Show in black and white because it would have been initially before the TV had things in color. They discussed current events, watched movies, flipped through magazines, and even dressed like it was 2 decades prior. There weren't very many mirrors in the house because they didn't want to disrupt that illusion. The only reminders the men had about their appearance were portraits they brought of their younger selves. So they literally had to think that it was 20 years earlier. And it's pretty interesting how this had a physical effect on them. So it reads here, let's see, the 8 elderly men involved in Langer's experiment became young again. And by the end of the week, their physical health reflected that psychological reversal of time. They showed substantial improvements in flexibility, dexterity, memory, hearing, posture, as I mentioned earlier, cognitive ability, and general well-being. And they even looked younger on the outside, not a lot, but enough to where it made a material difference after the experiment. So all that being said, I'm curious what your experience has been as far as how someone's mindset can actually affect them physically. So could you please start out by either sharing some stories initially or things you've seen where this has actually happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating because it's not about denial, right? They knew what they were doing. They weren't in denial that they were the age they were, but they were intentionally changing their mind about it, right? And yeah, I certainly have seen that throughout my career serving older adults where, you have certain people who you meet who are vibrant and optimistic and hopeful. And so they live that out. And one example that comes to mind is we had a gentleman on hospice services, I'll call him Howard. And he was over 100. His wife had died. He had had a successful career, which now had ended. He had lost most of his vision, was less active than he once was. so lifestyle had changed a lot. But he recognized every person that came into their room by their shape or their gait or their voice, even though he couldn't see us well. He made friends. He was interested in the ball games that followed the news. He was engaged in life. And he had a goal to ride 500 miles on a recumbent bike in 1 year. And he would walk down the halls.
Wow.
And he went on one of the honor flights in an open cockpit plane.
That's cool.
Because he had served in the Army Air Corps before the Air Force existed, and so he was honored that way when I think he was 99. And then we had who we called the anti-Howard, if you will, who also was a widower. He was actually a little younger, in his upper 90s, had a successful career, had some health challenges, and his outlook was completely different. He stayed in his apartment. He was very discouraged. He was really focused on whether he had enough scotch bottles in the cupboard, so to speak, and he was not engaged in a thriving life, sadly, right? Even though a lot of people loved him and cared for him and he had a lot of things to be thankful for, it was harder for him. And I'm not saying that in a judgmental way about who he is or was, but that I think, both of these men had trained their minds to think in a certain way about life. And then they lived that out. And it's self-fulfilling, right? Like I said, it's not denial that I'm not in this situation, but it's deciding how I'm going to respond to it.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
I have countless examples, but that's one that kind of comes to mind.
Would you say that with your tenure with working with older adults, that the person who is more or was more positive that you mentioned was more the norm, or was that kind of an outlier?
That's a good question. I would say this example, because they were both happening at the same time and we knew them both at the same time, it was kind of apparent. I would say probably like many traits of people, there's a spectrum where some people are more so. And in this case, I think, the one person was more extremely that way and the other far different. Most people, I would say, are somewhere on the spectrum. And, it does depend certainly to some degree on whether they have had cognitive changes, such as a stroke or illness that affects their cognition. That certainly can affect someone's mind and their ability to manage their thought life. But yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure if one is more prevalent. I should keep a tally maybe, right?
Yeah, right. Well,
yep.
And I wonder what external things can have an impact on that. Like, for example, could culture play a role?
Sure. I think culture, and particularly the culture of a family, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like each family has a culture, and whether we focus on what we're grateful for or what bad things have happened to us or what we're anticipating good things coming or whether we're anticipating disaster. We grow up and we're learning more and more now about epigenetics and how our genes manifest themselves, and that we're not just recipients of our genetic code. It can change, and yet over time those emotional traits are even replicated in our genes. So yeah, I think culture, and one that comes to mind is family, certainly.
Oh yeah. Well, and circling back to epigenetics, in layman's terms, can you at kind of a high level describe to people a little bit about that? I know a little bit about it, but not enough to speak to it. But
yeah, and I don't know a lot about it either. Just that Jen and I at least grew up in an era where we were told, you have these genes, they are what you were born with. Even though we did learn in science class that our cells are always regenerating, we were kind of given this belief that our genes are certain. And if even now, you many times I'll hear people say, well, my family had heart disease or a disposition for this particular disease, or we inherited our features, things like that. Which, that is borne out in the Genome Project, right? Which was groundbreaking. But epigenetics says that, here, I'm going to reference this one book that I read about how you can decide now to change things that will affect the next generation. So you can change your genetic makeup through what you do. And we know we could all come up with examples like what you eat, how you manage your stress, if you sleep well, if you use toxic substances, drugs and alcohol that affect your brain. Remember the old "This is your brain on drugs" commercials, right? Like
The
we know
eggs,
that
frying some eggs. Yeah.
frying eggs in a pan, right? So we know that certain things we do affect our bodies, which then affect our genetic makeup that is passed on to coming generations. So conversely, things we do that are beneficial to us can flip a generational code going forward.
That's fascinating.
Which I think is just empowering and is hopeful. So, okay, maybe I inherited something traumatic or a disease process, but it turns out you can, it says here, a growing body of research demonstrates you can control many of your neural connections, and that actually changes the structure of your brain. And we can get into more about that, the thoughts that can actually change you physiologically and your gene expression, and science is bearing that out. So to me, that's really empowering.
Oh yeah. Well, the whole idea of neuroplasticity, and how, I mean, I wrote about it in my book, but
Yeah.
I use it with the example of trying to be positive and to make an effort. And again, it doesn't mean that you're naive or that you're in denial about something,
Right.
but you still want to have a voice in how you experience it. So it could be something such as looking at something and making an effort to try to flip the script and make something positive out of it. And initially, it takes some effort. After a while, it becomes a habit, and then before you know it, it's more of a mindset. And there's also something that's called the confirmation bias that's out there, and algorithms now, and things like TikTok and other things like Reels on Facebook as well. I guess don't help in that regard, because when you like things, or if you watch full videos, you tend to get more that are of the same mindset. And if you are seeking things that are more negative, I question if that's going to affect what gets queued up for you. But with neuroplasticity, it's interesting how you can rewire certain aspects of your brain. There's a couple different kinds of neuroplasticity that I'm aware of. One is where, say, for example, somebody has a stroke or something pretty severe, and now it could be that other parts of their brain start taking on an activity that was done to the part that's now damaged. So you can adapt for different things. But then the other is more where you have a sense of control and have a voice in terms of trying to curtail your mindset on something.
Well, yeah, and I
So,
liked earlier in your introduction, you talked about perspective, and I read this quote too. Perception immobilizes, but perspective empowers.
yeah.
And I just thought that was a great distinction. It says you see and respond, and empowers you to see and respond to your situation from a different point of view. So we all perceive things through our senses, right? And then we think about those things that we perceived, but we can change our perspective and look at things from a different point of view. And
Oh, yeah.
that's empowering, whereas perception can be immobilizing. I never really thought about the distinction between that.
I could see
And
that.
it is, yeah.
So for
But yeah,
decades,
being able to change your brain. And yeah, I think that's just beautiful that we know that. And when I was in school, maybe decades ago, not that long ago, we didn't know about neuroplasticity. We didn't really consider that it was possible. We thought our brains were kind of fixed. And yet now we know more and more that that's not true.
yeah, absolutely. I remember just like for decades being afraid of going to dental appointments, and I was afraid of the needle. Even just walking into the office, I could smell. I'm not sure if it was the latex gloves or what, but I just knew that if I was blindfolded, I would know that I was in a dental office.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember during COVID, when my dental office had it set up where you could only go in for an appointment if it was like for cause. Like, say you knew you had a cavity or needed a root canal or whatever. There was no proactive cleanings because of the pandemic. So I remember I had to schedule an appointment and I couldn't do it and couldn't do it yet. And then finally the like either the county or the city or whatever lifted different restrictions. We could do things now. So I remember actually going to the dental office and sitting in the chair and saying to my dentist, thank you for the opportunity to be afraid today.
Mm.
Because I looked at it as whether I went there or not, I still needed the dental work, but at
Yep.
least I could finally be there. So my big joke was, Thank you for the opportunity to be afraid. But I viewed it through a lens of gratitude to be there. Whereas before I would more take it for granted and just kind of
Right.
think to myself, oh, I can't believe I had this appointment today. Whereas then I was grateful to have it. So
It's that have to versus get to. And my gentleman Howard that I referenced, I called him Howard. He and I talked about that, right? That I don't have to use this walker to safely get down the hall. I get to walk down the hall,
yes,
you know?
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Would you mind telling the listeners about that study that you were a part of where I think, for example, you asked people questions like, please
Mhm.
describe for me some terms you would use for
Yeah.
getting older and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I was part of a grant program through the state of Minnesota where we worked with older adults to help them prepare for the end of their life. We all know we're getting older one day at a time, thankfully.
I'm
And
not. Yeah.
well, and and yet we don't talk about it a lot in our culture. Back to your point about the culture, right? Some cultures really revere older people and celebrate that. Our culture doesn't so much. We're sort of, anti-aging cream and all the things, right? But we are indeed getting older. So we talked about how can we help people engage in those conversations so that we can help them live as well as possible for as long as they live and to live as long as they can. So yeah, we would do, and I can tell a little bit more about kind of the nature of the study, but we engaged in one-on-one conversations with individuals and in some peer groups of people and some of their family members as well, and learned out about a lot of things. But yeah, as Jen referenced, as you referenced, one of the kind of questions that I would begin by asking people is, what are some signs of aging? And Jen, I'm sure you can think of things that people might think of when you think about getting older.
They might say forgetful, or they might, or,
Right.
or like just things that are stereotypical.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, I can't see as well. And it's been bugging me lately when I see so many people who are at my age saying, oh, no, I'm just stiff in the morning. I can't see very well. This is what happens when we get older. And we even have a mutual friend, Jen and I, who went to the doctor years ago and maybe even in her 30s and had a couple questions for the doctor. And the doctor's answer to every question was, well, these things happen as we get older. Kind of just a resigned response, which is sad, right?
Mhm.
So I invite then people to consider another perspective that some signs of aging could be wisdom, confidence, character, strength. We often assume that things get worse as we get older, and I'm just at a point in my life where I'm going to defy that. I don't want my life to get worse. I want it to get better as long as I
Oh
live,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
absolutely.
why not? Like, why not do something that can have that come to pass?
Oh yeah.
So, and certain kinds of memory, you mentioned memory forgetfulness, certain kinds of memory actually improve with age, such as vocabulary, what's called theory of mind or perspective taking. Wisdom is another way to kind of say it. I don't know if you've ever heard of gerotranscendence. Ever heard
No.
of gerotranscendence? So when you think about the stages of life, right, like infancy, childhood, adolescence, old, so on. Gerotranscendence is this age at the end of life when people have achieved peace and acceptance.
Mm.
Um, and there's a couple psychologists, Barbara Fredrickson and Daniel Kahneman, um, who have a related theory, psychological theory, called the peak end rule. Have you ever heard of
Oh,
this?
no.
So the idea is that when you think back on an event or an experience, your recollections and opinions are heavily influenced by what happened at the peak intensity, whether it's good or bad. So think about like a certain chapter of your life, your childhood, your college years, the birth of a child, a vacation, a certain job you had or your career. Your most vivid memories are the most intense or emotional aspect of it. So the peak, let's say, and the end. So you're going to, like, let's say you went on a cruise. You're going to remember kind of the high points or the most intense points. Like, let's say you got in a storm at sea, that you would remember that, right? Intensity and the end, how it ended, if it ended well or not. So that's why restaurants often focus on having 5-star desserts, because the meal ends well and their customers have a good remembrance of that, right? So the focus of our study was to help people end their lives well with peace and acceptance and hope and not denial, right? Not pretending they're
Nice.
not getting older or then they may not come to the end of their life, but reframing that. So maybe I hoped I could spend my retirement this way, but it didn't work out that way. So how can I reframe my hopes and still have a hopeful life and a peaceful life satisfaction?
Well, I think too many people don't realize that there's a difference between quantity and quality of life.
Mm,
And if you can have, I mean, I look at it as we can't control the quantity of our life per se, but we can influence the quality of it,
yep,
at least. And that to me is just a great thing, and
absolutely.
um, excuse me. I know my grandma is almost 100. And so every week I get to go visit her. I do her laundry. We sit and talk. And I know that I can't really say, so grandma, what have you been up to lately? Because it's probably just like watching TV. So instead I'll say, so grandma, what was it like to grow up during the Great Depression? Or what was it like
Mhm.
before TVs existed or whatever? And sometimes her answers to things are quite comical. So she grew up in Cloquet, Minnesota, which is up by Lake Superior, just like I did, and my parents did, and all my aunts and uncles were all from the same small town. But I asked her, I said, Grandma, do you remember back when Cloquet didn't have cars or when they just weren't that common yet? And she goes, oh, yeah. Like she remembers riding in a Model T. And I said, well, for all those people who didn't have a car yet, because I imagine they're probably pretty expensive, how would they get to work? And she looks at me like it's the dumbest question ever. And she goes, they would walk. I'm like, oh, okay. Whereas nowadays, a lot of people would be like, well, I'm not going to walk that far. And this is northern
Right?
Minnesota. Yeah, where it's freezing,
Oh, that. Yeah.
So excuse me. So kind of funny. And then
Well, and
oh, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, and reminiscing is shown, and nostalgia is shown to actually decrease anxiety, to strengthen relationships, and to improve memory. And it's
As a matter,
meaningful, right? I have found that in
yes,
my work so much.
I could
Were you
see
going to say
that.
more?
Oh, well, there's a whole chapter in my book about nostalgia and
Hmm.
how it can, yeah, how
Yeah.
it can affect people physically. And it's why if I get out my great grandma's china to use it for an Easter meal or something like that, it means a lot more to my grandma because they were her
Mhm.
mom's dishes, and it's just that nostalgia. Like it's like her food tastes better because she likes the
Yep.
plates, because it just has
That's
that
true.
meaning. And
Well, and when
now
we sit, go ahead.
oh, to somebody else, they're just plates, but to her it
Exactly.
has meaning.
Or my husband always says, "Did you throw away my mother's soup ladle?" No, I did not. We have the ladle, the soup ladle. But yeah,
It's
for
funny.
sure. Like we thought when we framed this study that people would be most focused on their physical condition and their prognosis and the treatments available to them, but that wasn't the case. What was one of the most meaningful things was life reflection, thinking back on these meaningful memories, and kind of going back and being grateful for the good things and also grateful that you made it through the hard things, right? Like life is full of hard things. And looking
Oh
back on
yeah.
those things was so important and really
I
meaningful.
I feel like when you can view things that others would view negative through a
Mm,
positive lens, it gives pain a purpose, and then you feel like you can own it rather than having it own you. And I know on the first anniversary of when I got my brain tumor diagnosis, this is like 10 years ago now, but I remember I on that anniversary, I set my alarm for like a half hour earlier than when I would have got the news the year before. And I went to the same spot on my bedroom and where the bedroom and the bathroom floor would meet. And because that's where I dropped to my knees the year before when I got the diagnosis and was in tears. But this time I began to pray
mm,
and I just said, God, thank you that I survived the surgery. Thank you that I survived. I mean, I went through this whole list of viewing it in a very positive way. Well, then on the second anniversary, I did the same thing where I set my alarm. I went back to that same spot on my carpet where I got down and was praying. And this time I thanked God for the fact that the
mm,
tumor had happened to me. And the lens that I viewed my situation through was one of at that time I had begun a fair amount of public speaking and had the idea of the book that I wrote and all that kind of stuff. And I saw that by sharing the things that helped me in my experience with others, it was like, my health condition at that time was secondary. It was more like how I got through it, that other people could relate to it. And yeah, I viewed it through a lens of gratitude, you
Right.
know,
And
and that's probably
you never would have asked for that to happen to you, but
correct.
now you wouldn't trade it, right? Because of how
Correct.
it's enriched your
Correct.
life and you've been able to impact so many other people.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. I have talked to strangers at airports. I've met people, when I've been traveling for work, different places, people on buses, like just random, strangers. And yeah, it's pretty interesting. And it gives you an enhanced appreciation for things in everyday life. Like if I
Mhm.
hear birds sing or see green grass, I think I'm grateful that I can hear. I'm grateful that I
Mhm.
can see, things that maybe before I would have taken for granted. But
Yep.
with the people that were a part of your study, did you notice any kind of any themes as far as things that people were grateful for with the gift of hindsight, or things that maybe could have been viewed negatively, but they were choosing to view it through a positive lens?
Sure. But before I answer that, let me tell you that what you just described is that you are displaying self-coherence. I don't know if you've ever heard of that
I have
term.
not.
So they have identified that as an indicator that people with the highest life satisfaction have self-coherence. It's a trait. And it means that they view life as comprehensible, manageable, meaningful. It's coherent, right? It clings together, and it's the opposite of despair. So, for instance, like you said, there are three facets to it or characteristics of it. One is acceptance and predictability. So it's being realistic about your life, knowing that good and bad things happen. That's expected, right? So when something happens, you don't say like, how could this happen to me? You know, I actually have known people who are like that. Like, why did this happen to me? Well, because bad things happen sometimes, right?
I
So
I was
that
the opposite, where people would say to me, Jen, don't you wonder why this happened to you? And I'm like, it's a numbers game. Why would it not happen to
I
me?
would
Like
not.
I didn't, I wasn't gonna let it own me. You know what I mean? Like
Right. So it's that realistic. You're being realistic, right? So acceptance, predictability. The second characteristic is optimism and faith. Things will work out. We will learn from our setbacks. We'll rise to the challenges, and we'll have resilience, right? Which is what you've experienced.
Oh,
And
wait a
then the
minute. You
third,
mean you mean emotional grit?
yes, exactly,
How's that for a shameless plug? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
totally. And then thirdly, empowerment. So you gain coping skills and resourcefulness and confidence, which leads to improved life and higher purpose. And so that's what you're displaying. You've experienced that in these last 10 years, that
Oh
it's
yeah.
leading to more satisfaction with your life, whatever comes down the road, right?
Mhm.
And so I will get back to
Absolutely.
your question about the people I've seen, but so just on this theme, a couple of things that improve people's sense of coherence are choice, autonomy, a sense of control, like I can make decisions for myself, and reflection, as I referenced earlier, that nostalgia. It benefits physical and mental health and strengthens relationships. So those two things are a way to achieve that life satisfaction. But as far as themes, I would say um, I've had people who just enjoy reflecting on different experiences they have. For many people, it's something like military service, even though that might have been 1 or 2 or 4 years of their life. Some, of course, have a lifelong military career, but many of the people I serve have just had a short time in the military, and it was very significant and meaningful for them, even though it probably wasn't an easy experience. Leaving, no cell phones, no way to communicate back home. My own father-in-law was in Korea during the war, and he couldn't readily connect with his family back home. Um, so that's one example. Another would be, um, maybe a meaningful career. I've had clients who, for instance, were teachers or business owners or farmers or whatever it was. That was my dad, who farmed at this farm behind me here after his father and his father before him. He said often that he didn't consider farming to be a job. It was a lifestyle. And so,
Hmm.
yes, he got up every morning at the break before dawn to milk the cows, and he worked every day of the year, right? But it was a lifestyle that he found meaningful and purposeful.
There
So,
was somebody that I met years ago who traveled a lot for work before I began traveling for work. And he was gone so much that I said to him, I said, don't you miss being home? I said, you're just gone so much. And he looks at me kind of puzzled and he goes, Jen, the road is my home.
Mm,
And he had had his travel territory for so long that when he would go visit people, they would proactively invite him to go to their kids' baseball games, or he would meet people for dinner, or he'd
mhm.
run marathons, or whatever in other states. But yeah, he looked kind of puzzled. He's like, the road
Yeah,
is my home. And
that's
I realized when I
right
began
along.
traveling a lot for work that the TSA agents at the Minneapolis airport, after a while, I got to know them by name and they got to know my name, and I knew
Wow.
servers at restaurants, and I literally have scheduled flights before that were like connecting flights based on an airport with a restaurant where I wanted to have lunch. I'm like, well, I could go through LaGuardia where I could get crust pizza, or I could go through
Nice.
Atlanta, and in their ACON course they have a PF Chang's, and I kind of want lettuce wraps. So yeah, I would go through Atlanta instead of New York for
That sounds delicious. So what you're
but
saying is I
it's
shouldn't
perspective.
pretend to be you because they would recognize
Yeah,
immediately.
right. But it's perspective.
It's perspective. Yeah, for sure. I would say another big one that isn't surprising, but I'll tell you something surprising about it is relationships. Um, and have you heard of the happiness study, happiness project? It's one
As a
of the
matter of
longest
fact,
studies.
that is referenced in the article that I have here about the
Okay.
counterclockwise study that we're talking about tonight. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
go ahead.
Really long study over like 8 decades studying happiness. I don't know if you were going to say more about it, but
No, you're good.
they identified that relationships were one of the most critical factors in health and happiness, both. And that was the surprising part. The director said it goes to reason that if people have better relationships, they'll be happier. But they were very surprised to find that the people with the best relationships also had lower disease processes, inflammation. I think
I'm not
that is just
surprised.
fascinating. And
As a
I
matter of
think
fact,
that's true.
oh yeah. As a matter of fact, there is this residential community in Sweden where they have older people, so over a certain age, that live there. And then they also have younger people who are new to the country. So new to the culture, new to the language, all that kind of stuff, living in the same residential area together, with the thought that to live there, part of it is you have to actually interact with each other and do stuff. I forget if it's so much each day or so much each week or whatever it is. But a lot of people might think about the benefits that the older people would have being around younger people, but it goes both ways because from what I read, some of the younger people would do things like take piano lessons from the older person who had been around for
Yeah.
a while and taken the piano for a while. It might be that maybe a younger person wants to learn more about cars. And maybe the older person had had a career, working on cars. So there are benefits both ways. And with this facility, and as a matter of fact, I have an article right here from the BBC called The Housing Project Where Young and Old Must Mingle.
Mm.
And there's a picture here of someone who I'm guessing is maybe 30 playing foosball with someone who's quite a bit older. And just because you're significantly different in age doesn't mean you can't have common interests,
Mm.
and the facility has helped people who came from other cultures, other countries, kind of integrate and get used to things. And then with the older people, it helps them just feel less isolated,
Oh,
and feel
beautiful.
valued for what they can bring to the
Yeah,
table.
both ways, right? Like both of those. I
Mhm.
just heard someone today talk about a building where they, during COVID, had gone to virtual wait staff, so to speak, like little
Mhm.
robotic servers that would come and take the orders for the people who lived in this building for their meals. And they said, no, we don't want that anymore. We want the teenage servers that you can hire and come in here and talk to us.
Yes.
Because there's meaning in that intergenerational interaction.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I can see that for sure,
Yeah,
but
and the fact that it affects physical and emotional and mental and cognitive health, right? Like Dr. Ira Byock, he wrote a beautiful book called The Four Things That Matter Most. And he
okay.
has examples of patient outcomes and the tremendous effect of people who said these four things to people. I love you, thank you, please forgive me, and I forgive you. And he gives accounts of patients he worked with who were able to do those things Sometimes even forgiving someone who had already died or they couldn't, literally talk to, but being able to forgive them so they didn't carry that burden themselves.
Yeah. Wow.
And, it's been shown through research too that unforgiveness and bitterness leads to disease. Dr. Caroline Leaf says like 78 to 90% of diseases and illnesses are a result of thoughts to some degree.
Isn't that crazy?
So being able to reconcile relationships and to value relationships. And for us, I was talking with a friend just recently about how it takes intention to stop scrolling and actually reach out to a person, right? And maybe we need to go back to sitting on our porch and talking to the neighbors and connecting with people.
I know.
And that's one of the nice things about, living in community. The people that I serve, many of them live in assisted livings or care centers. And so they're living in a community setting, which has its challenges, but also can really prevent loneliness and isolation where, if you're at home and no one's coming by. My husband and I went on a walk recently just as this big snowstorm was beginning. And so he said, let's stop and see our neighbor, Jim. And so we did. And he lives alone. And he was just delighted to have us come in and sit at the table and talk for a while. And it didn't cost us anything. And he could tell us stories of his career in plowing snow in Minnesota.
Yeah.
So it was just one example that a small effort can have big dividends in our health and well-being.
Oh, yeah. Well, and there was another study that was done by the same psychologist from Harvard who did the counterclockwise study. It's called the chambermaid study. I have a little bit of a excerpt about it here. It reads, her famed chambermaid study, for instance, saw a group of hotel maids drastically change their health via the placebo effect. With a simple tweak in perception, the maids began viewing their laborious jobs as exercise, which led to weight loss, blood pressure improvements, and increased well-being through the group. So yeah, so by viewing their job differently, and realize that, hey, I'm here to get a workout, I'm here to whatever. So again, they're doing the same tasks, but by viewing them differently, it affected them in a positive way physically, But is there anything that I haven't asked about today that I should be, or anything just kind of that you want to share, whether it's about a study or someone you've met or talked about with getting
Yeah, I
older?
mean, you could probably not get me to stop telling stories about the fascinating people I've met over my career, but what is exciting to me is just more and more that we're learning the power of our minds. So a couple of things that I've just been thinking about lately is just how empowering and hopeful that is. As I said, we're all going to be facing difficult things in our lives. It's sometimes people say you're either coming out of a storm, you're in a storm, or you're going into a storm, right? That's life. But one thing I recommend is, I don't know if you can see that book.
No.
I can share it. The Life-Changing Art of Self-Brain Surgery. And it's by a neurosurgeon, Dr. Lee Warren, who experienced trauma when his son was murdered and was really just devastated, as you can't imagine, actually. But he since then has learned really the power of changing your mind and how it physiologically changes. I heard him speak recently here in Minnesota, and he talked about how I can cut your brain open and change you with a scalpel, or you can change your own brain physiologically. And that really came to light for him when he saw a functional MRI. You've had MRIs, Jen, where this is a beautiful example. They told a woman subject to think about like the worst thing that ever happened to her, the worst day of her life. And her brain started lighting up on the scan, and blood flow and her heart rate increased, and physiological symptoms they could see. And then they told her to think about a wonderful day, joyful memory, and her physical symptoms changed immediately. Her amygdala started lighting up on the scan, her heart rate decreased, and it's so powerful. So he has a podcast, he has written books, and he really is empowering people that you can change your life, really.
Have a voice in it. For sure.
Yeah. Wow. And he has, his real beautiful scientific, I kind of geek out on the science of it, and the science of why that works and how the neurons in our brain fire and that we can have an impact on that. And then also how faith intertwines. And the Bible has a lot of scriptures about the power of the mind and our thoughts. And that is now bearing out. He says that it's neurologically true and it's theologically true, both. And it's so I think that's cool when we see that bearing out in real life. And one other example I just ran across recently is the nocebo effect. Have you heard about that?
No.
So there's a number of PubMed studies that discuss different studies that showed this, but the one I ran across was about a man who went into the emergency room after having intentionally overdosed on his antidepressants to end his life. And then he had a change of heart and decided, no, I don't want to die. I want to live. And he went to the emergency room and he was in distress. And so they were giving him IVs to revive his body and trying to save him. And meanwhile, they were running around trying to figure out the best interventions because they didn't know what antidepressant he took because he was in a study and it was a blind study, so he didn't know what the medication was. Well, they were able to find the information and then inform him that he wasn't taking a medication, he was taking a placebo. It was inert. And
Wow.
when he learned that, his physical symptoms resolved. And that is shocking,
amazing.
right? Like that's right. It's just one example, but it's such a powerful example that it's really true that his mind believed he overdosed, and so his body believed him.
That's
It's
crazy.
fascinating. And there's other studies that were linked that show like someone was given a treatment for a headache and a certain percentage of people reported adverse effects from the medication, and then a number of people dropped out entirely because they couldn't tolerate the medication. And people who weren't taking the medication, they were taking the placebo. So they call it the nocebo effect.
Wow. That's interesting.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? And so to me, I think that's cool for medicine because the placebo effect works. If you decide you might benefit from taking this food or medicine, it will help you. But conversely, if you believe something bad is going to happen to you, it's more likely that it will because you believe that. So
Yeah,
to me, it's
pretty crazy.
exciting at this time in history when our world is shrinking, so to speak. We're all hearing the news from all across the globe, and it's a lot for our brains to take in, that we can decide that we are going to be hopeful and we can actually change our lives, the lives of people around us.
No, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for doing what you do, for the clients you work with. And of course, that also benefits their families, and people now today can take the studies we talked about and the studies that were shared to help their situations as well. And for those of you who are listening, thank you for being here too. As I mentioned earlier, my podcast channel, so to speak, on YouTube is Emotional Grit. So feel free to like and subscribe and your other episodes as well. So thank you, Steph, and thank you, listeners, as well.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks for having me.